Hello and welcome to another episode of Enter the Boardroom with Nurole, the business podcast that brings the boardroom to you. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of Nurole. At this point, my marketing team suggested a lengthy piece on why more boards should be using Nurole to hire their next chair, non-executive director, trustee or board advisor. Rather than bore you with that, I'll cut to the chase. We're the market leader now in the board space, doing 1,000 board placements annually, and we focus exclusively on non-executive appointments, giving us deep and current board search expertise. Our members tell us they want more roles. If every person listening now could send just one board role Nurole's way in the next 3 years, opportunities will increase exponentially for everyone. As the saying goes, communities grow great when people plant trees whose shade they will never know. Today's guest, Daniel Kasmir, is Chief People and Procurement Officer at TalkTalk, Trustee at the Lowry Arts Centre, Chairman of the Remuneration Committee at YouView TV, and Chairman of the Employment Board at HMP Thorncross. Over the past 30 years, Daniel has managed people issues in a range of sectors across listed, investor-backed and public sector organisations, both in the UK and internationally. Daniel, a huge welcome and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Delighted to be here.
Daniel, I want to talk about engaging talent at the board level because I know very few organisations who don't say that talent is their most important asset, and yet very few who seem to really walk the walk as opposed to just talking the talk. And I'd be interested to start just by talking about your experience in the talent space. You have a very unusual title, holding both this responsibility for people and procurement. When I saw this, I thought that's absolutely genius. Putting those two things together makes so much sense. I've seen, both as an investor and an employee, that people making mistakes by changing costs without taking the people factor. Can you just talk to us a bit about how that came about and how that works?
When I joined TalkTalk, I was very kindly offered the opportunity to be the Chief People Officer. And we talked about the organisation and how it's hung together. And I saw the procurement function and I said to the Chief Executive, if there's an opportunity for me to look after the procurement function as well, I'd really love to. And she was kind enough to give me the opportunity to do so. And the driver to do that was when I looked at how the organisation was spending its money. In this particular case, we spend quite a lot of money on routers to put into the customers' houses and stuff. But an awful lot of the money we spend is to do with buying services from third organisations, be that software development, be that customer contact centres, etc. And there was a clear notion that if we are spending quite a lot of our money on procuring services that involve people, why don't we get the person that looks at people to think about it more broadly? Don't just stop at the right, we've got this number of people on payroll, but look at it much more broadly. So in our particular circumstance, we have a couple of thousand people that sit on our payroll, but we've really got 3,000 or 4,000 people that are contributing in other ways, providing services to customers. So actually, this has come together quite nicely. And it's been a pretty good thing for the HR team as a whole, because it's given them the opportunity to look more broadly and more commercially at what we do. And actually, critically, it's helped us with some of our buying decisions and deciding how to best structure and shape the organisation.
Really interesting. So for a board member listening to this going, gosh, that's a genius idea, I'm going to go away and talk to our CEO and challenge them to think about potentially doing that. What are the pitfalls that they should be aware of? What are the lessons that you've learned, bringing that function into your responsibilities that other boards would do well to look out for?
It's different. In the procurement of services and the hiring of talent, you're just looking at two very different things. In one area, you're looking at it on a very individualistic basis and suppliers. But I think that it's absolutely reasonable as you assess and you work with third-party suppliers, not just to let it be a cost-based consideration, but actually get into the organisation and actually start to understand their own processes for talent, how well engaged their people are, etc. The thing that we've really got to do well is to have as a high employee net promoter score, which is something we get very excited about. It's absolutely consistent that those people who are talking to our customers on our behalf put equal measure and weight into that. And that's something we do and we nudge and we change as we go. But just recognise that the language as the starting point are going to be a little bit different. But actually, we found it to be really quite helpful. So I remember the first couple of times we got to speak to the people who were leading the people stuff in some of our customer supplier organizations. They were like, oh, wow, this is really novel, this is good. And didn't really have any particular pushback. We just wanted to see and understand how they went on that journey. And it was actually quite good. And then we were able to share processes, share approaches, and it was entirely helpful.
Really interesting. Now, when you think about investing in people across the organization, I'm really curious to understand how you think about that and how you think about the major levers or investment opportunities you have. I wrestle with this a lot. One of the things, we do a lot, I think, for an organization of our scale on the talent side, but I sometimes struggle to calculate the return on investment of some of the things that I do. So, for example, we do a tea every day at 4:00 and we bring the entire organization together, and it's brilliant because it suddenly we were having problems with cross-functional silos where the engineering and the product team were not spending enough time with our customer facing teams, and suddenly something like that tea every day at 4, bring them together, fosters those connections that start to break down those barriers. But I struggle to put a value on that. How do I value that relative to the cost? I'm really interested to know how you think about that return on investment equation and how you think about the different areas that you can invest in on that talent side.
So I think that there are a couple of strands. There's a fairly conventional strand where you look at your leadership, you look at your emerging talent, and you put appropriate talent programs that are together that are in place for them. And that's driven by your success areas, getting better at succession planning, et cetera, et cetera. But then I think on the other side, there's the whole value add, consideration of value add around culturally where you sit and what you're trying to do as an organization. So, for a long time, that had been a very subjective situation. And I think that one of the things I found really quite helpful from the advent of technology is the ability to measure organizations using data much more effectively to see how people are and where they're at. One of the things that I've seen emerge, I think one of the most helpful things that I've seen emerge in the last few years has been the quite swift uptake of being able to measure employee net promoter score on a regular basis. And there are now numerous software providers that are offering some really quite good platforms that let you jump in and measure the organization. Some people do it monthly, some people every couple of months, and it's transformative. So I come from a world of, mentioned grey hair 30 years ago. The annual employee survey, which took 6 to 8 weeks to administer, another 3 months for the results to come back. And once you'd seen them, they were already out of date. And that was a moment in time. What we're able to do now is real time take assessments of the organization, where people are, where engagement is, and actually get quite precise and quite open in terms of where value is, what's going on, what's going well, et cetera, et cetera. We can make it competitive. We can be very transparent. Previously, this had been a very secret, dark art. There's no point having a dark art when it comes to leadership of your people. So we've held onto very closely employee net promoter score, something that I think is incredibly important, something that I think will just grow in weight as we go forwards. And through clever software, we're able to see, where's the positions of strength in the organization, where's the positions of weakness, through all sorts of different lenses. The most obvious one is looking at particular leaders. How are they doing? Where are people engaged? Crikey, we've had situations where we've had people who have got very low employee net promoter scores, and you jump in and you start to deal with it and fine. And then you have issues that get generated at a macro level across the organization, again, which you can jump in and you start to solve and deal with. What it also does is it pushes you to think about some of the counterintuitive stuff. So you sit there behind your desk and you'll make a judgment of the organization. Well, I think if we did a little bit more of this, that would be quite helpful. Whereas what the data will start to say is actually no. Just there's a couple of outliers that are coming through, which you might want to think about. And I think in our organisation, the things that come across as being quite important to people are obviously communication, understanding of strategy. That's what you would expect in lots of places. Community is also an important thing, and being able to be attached. And then you say, okay, right, fine. How do we then work through and we drive greater levels of attachment. And we've spent a reasonable amount of time doing some of that.
Really interesting. Just picking up on the people analytics piece of that, because that's certainly been a real revelation to me over the last few years, moving into more of an operational role. And I sometimes scratch my head and wonder why every organization has not got weekly analytics in place. And yet, as a board member, I've sometimes struggled actually to convince CEOs of the value of this. And normally, actually, what happens is I show them the analytics dashboard I have, and they're like, "Wow, I want one like that." You say, "Well, it's really easy. It costs you $7 a month per person, or whatever it is, and you can do it." And then they hit a roadblock. They get pushback from their employees, from their leadership team, saying, they don't want to be monitored or things like that. What's your experience of rolling things like this out, and how have you achieved most success?
The thing that's fundamentally important is transparency here. I mentioned before that employee data and sharing stuff had been a bit of a dark art. And I think the thing that I found when we started measuring employee net promoter on a frequent basis, there was a little bit of like, gee whiz, what are we going to do? People are going to see each other's scores. What's going to happen? And after a couple of months of like, actually, it galvanizes and you get quite positive energy coming through the organization. And often it's quite difficult to get organizations to focus on the people agenda very seriously, but because it's been quite subjective. When you put it into an objective format, it actually creates a hunger, and people are looking at, okay, well, I don't want to be sort of bottom of the table, so what are we going to do? And it generates an energy and a level of involvement that people are starting to get stuck into. And then you start to see the cause and effect in terms of there being a correlation between employee net promoter score, and ultimately it helps move your business in the right direction. Why don't more people do it? Get asked this question a lot. It's still a lot of the data that has been supplied through commercial systems. They do feel like they are commercial systems generating data, and they're not hugely accessible. I'm really pleased that there's a group of people who are now developing employee data, which is much more user-friendly. You can look at a page and you can interpret it and you can share it. And I think through that sharing, through that simplicity, you can then pick on the 3 or 4 levers that will contribute to organization success. So I think to answer your question in a very rambling way, I think it's been way too complicated, trying to measure way too many things. And ultimately, it's been like, where do I go? What do I do?
One of the other things that I suppose I've probably been on the back end of as an employee is, endless surveys that didn't go anywhere. And so one of the things that I implemented quite early was something to close the loop. So we have a committee that meets quarterly that takes representatives from different parts of the business that basically analyze the data. It's all anonymized but aggregated, and they analyze it, and then they come up with recommendations, which they will then bring to our head of talent. And that's been a very nice way to close that loop and for people to understand that the feedback they give in those things really matters and moves the needle. How do you go about creating that sense of we are actually listening and acting on it? I'm always interested to see how organizations go about that.
Yeah, so it happens in two principal ways. So we sort of, we'll click the button, we'll put the survey on for a week, and then the results will come back. And then, of course, the next code, we look at it, and there's a bit of like oohing and ahhing and saying, okay, fine, this is good in terms of the headlines. Then within each business unit, we'll take a look at, okay, what are some of the levers and drivers? And then very importantly, we have regular operating boards that happen in all of our business units. And one of the agenda items is around engagement and what's going on, and particularly what steps are you taking within your business unit to address some of the shortcomings, to build on some of the strengths. But it's regular discussion. So it's just keeping it there as a regular narrative. And then we follow a similar process with our staff group, we call it One Voice here. And I meet with them on a regular basis. And again, they see, we discuss, and we just listen. But it's not just listening. We have to keep going back with plans and actions of what we're doing. And then once every 2 or 3 months, we'll bring the organization together and we'll say, right, okay, these were the scores. This is what we heard. And this is what we're doing about it. And so as a leadership group, we very much hold each other accountable for actually making things happen.
Yeah, really interesting.
Otherwise, as you say, it's just an exercise that just, some great PowerPoint slides, but doesn't do very much.
The other thing you touched on earlier was around what you're doing in terms of learning and development for your manager program. we've been through a journey on that where I think we started, like every organization, thinking we were quite good doing a one-off annual review, and then quickly realized actually that was pretty rubbish, and it was always just capturing whatever happened to be front of mind. So we then moved to quarterly, and then we found actually quarterly was too frequent. The amount of time we were spending on it was taking forever. Things weren't really changing from one quarter to the next. We moved to every 4 months and still found that too frequent, and have now settled on 6 months. And that now feels about the right cadence, where you get really meaty, meaningful feedback, but it's not so frequent that it's just completely debilitating for the whole organization. We layer that on top of, everyone has a weekly one-to-one or bi-weekly one-to-one, as well as quarterly personal development sessions. Do you have like a cadence that you roll out across the whole organization that you look to model as best practice?
The cadence is very similar to yours, to be honest with you. I think that I place the greatest attachment to that weekly one-to-one that happens. And it was quite interesting during COVID, and as we have this debate about participation, attendance in the office, etc., we've really continued to place lots and lots and lots of focus on that one-to-one. And we've said to our line managers that it's really important that those are face-to-face sessions because they're so important. Then we'll have, a little bit like you, we'll have the 6 monthly, and then we will look at the individual performance targets on a more regular basis. And we keep trying different techniques, different ways of making this better and better. But I think that my best experience with this is line managers having good conversations with their people. And I think if those happen with the appropriate degree of frequency, that's when you start to see the lift up in terms of how people perform.
Okay, really interesting. Now, you touched a little bit earlier also on the topic of remote work, which seems to be going through a really interesting journey at the moment. We've actually just implemented through various, actually we've been testing in different formats, but we've landed on a 3-2 split where we figured out hybrid working didn't work for us, where we had some people in, some people out. And so we now have everybody in for 3 days and everybody remote for 2 days. And when they're remote, we have an online platform that they can come and sort of meet in a virtual world in. And that seems to be in line with, I think it was research from Gallup showing that seems to be the peak productivity. But it feels like we're at the very beginning of figuring this out, and we haven't got a long enough set of data to really know what's right. How are you approaching this challenge?
So we're similar to many organisations in terms of an expectation that people are in the office 2 to 3 days a week. So it's fine. Occasionally we do keep an eye on sort of what's going on and stuff, and if we need to sort of call out as been a bit sluggish in a particular area, it's fine. But what we're trying to do more than anything else is to create reasons for people to come into the office. So we've invested quite a lot in our sort of office in terms of having plenty of collaborative spaces. What we try to do is to encourage people where there are workshops, where there's a need for collaboration, please come to the office. We encourage people to have their team sessions face to face. We encourage people, as I said before, to have their one-to-ones face to face. In terms of sort of where we end up with this, I find it difficult to envisage a time when we'll see people back in the office 5 days a week, and I expect that this 3-day-a-week thing will stick around for a while. At the moment, the measures of the productivity of what works well, what doesn't work well, I don't know, they're a bit sparse, and I'm not sure how objective they are. The thing that we do find is that when people come to the office, they have a sort of a workshop, they are together, you do get that water cooler stuff happening, and people break out into discretionary conversation, which fixes things, which moves things forwards more than sort of they would do where you've got to have a sort of prescribed appointment stuck on Teams, and that just seems to be sort of more limiting. I've grown up in a world of work where people come to the office, so it's trying to sort of stay in the heads of the people who are sort of 20 to 30, who have got quite a different perspective how this stuff works. And I think we've got to recognise we've got many different generations of people at work. And I think there's some stuff that happened during COVID which just caused society just to function differently. And that won't go back in the box. And we've just got to find ways of driving appropriate productivity in quite different approaches to work.
Yeah, it's really interesting because there's a lot of research suggesting there's a big disconnect between what CEOs think and what employees think, where most CEOs seem to believe that people should be back in the office in person, and whereas most employees seem to think that actually they're more productive outside, and one of them has to be wrong. And I sort of find myself, I look at my own experience, and what I definitely noticed if I benchmark some of our entry take level intakes coming in, is that those who came in the year when we moved fully remote during COVID, they ended up being behind the previous generation. It was quite easy to benchmark. And I would say it's quite a significant difference. And what I'm not sure about is that because there's something fundamental about the way you learn in an office environment, or is it because of the way that we hadn't adapted to teaching and bringing people up to speed in that office environment? So I probably find myself leaning into that sort of aggregate CEO camp, where I think I see value in both being in person, and I also see value in deep work and being remote. I think the one thing I don't like is hybrid. But what's your take on that? Are CEOs wrong in their belief that people are better off, or why is there this disconnect?
Oh gosh, one of the things that's patently obvious is that we found it in COVID. That guess what? Recruitment carried on during COVID, and people sort of been in a situation where they didn't actually meet their boss face to face for maybe 18 months. And there's no question in that circumstance, the people that joined the organisation without the chance to work with colleagues, etc., just struggled to grab hold of DNA, the culture of the place. And I think that rose back to the point that COVID was foisted upon us. And what we sought to do was to put all sorts of processes and systems in place, which were extensions of the world that we'd come from, as opposed to the world that we're actually existing in now. And I think that what we're going to have to do is to re-engineer all sorts of employee-based processes to actually recognise and get the most out of people in this hybrid world of work. So from a chief exec looking in, without changing those systems, I think they're absolutely right. We will not get the most out of people without a significant re-engineering. And I think it falls upon us through the use of technology, through the use of communication, to recognise that actually it's different. And there are benefits that where the work's done, where we choose to recruit from, etc., that could actually help us quite significantly. But I think that we shouldn't underestimate how we've got to adjust some quite fundamental systems to be able to let hybrid work give us the same degree of productivity that those conventional systems gave us when they were built up around. If you take something like productivity or measurement of performance in the office, we could have a wander around and we could see people there at their desks and this, that, and the other. We don't have that visibility now. We think that everyone sits at home watching daytime TV and waiting for Amazon parcels. And so you have the occasional flare-up, don't you, of organisations saying, well, we're going to measure people's keyboard clicks and we're going to measure this, that, and the other, which again is Byzantine. And it's again taking an old technology and saying, well, right, come on, let's be the thought police and we can work out. So I think that there's an adjustment and there's a discussion, and I think there's an opportunity for technology companies to think about, okay, how do we drive productivity satisfactorily in this hybrid world? So I don't think this hybrid world is going to go away. I think we've got to find a better way of engaging with it.
Interesting. One of the topics that often comes up and is a source of huge interest to certainly Nurole members is the Remco. I'm really interested to understand how you think about the Remco, both as, with your executive hat on, but also as the chair of what do you see as the role of the Remco, and also interested to understand how you see that it operates differently in a sort of private equity context versus, say, a publicly listed context, because I know you've had experience of both.
I think the Remco exists in both in private equity and within PLCs. Of course, governance is really important, and just making sure that you've got the basis of governance covered off properly, of course, is really, really, really important. And quite a lot of Remco time is devoted to that. So that's important. I think then, though...
Can I just check, when you say governance, because I hear lots of different people meaning different things when they say governance, what does governance mean to you?
There are certain codes that we just need to make sure. So let's make sure that we've got the proper governance in place for making adjustments to people's packages, for setting people's packages, etc. So there's controls. I suppose that's probably the most appropriate thing. Then looking at some of the more topical, almost legislative type stuff, such as gender pay, equal pay, etc., making sure that that's covered off properly is just part of the sort of the furniture of running a Remco properly and effectively, and making sure you've got those things sort of covered off. Then there's some quite scientific approaches, and there are some quite a little bit more artistic approaches to sort of Remco. Remcos are, when they're well run, are very aligned to the strategy of the organisation and do a good job in terms of aligning the pay of the chief exec, the rest of the execs, to delivering organisation business success. But if that goes a bit awry and it's just a little bit too disconnected or a bit too esoteric or a bit too complicated, it's not helpful to anybody.
Where would you say non-execs can add most value at the Remco?
There's very little that happens in business life that isn't a repeat or a variation on a theme that hasn't happened before. The great thing that the board directors are able to bring to the party is, well, actually, I saw a situation that was quite akin to ours a little while ago, and we tried this, and it worked, or it didn't work. So I think that there is just a knowledge and an experience. I guess it's the example, isn't it, of the sort of tacit knowledge. You have the guy who's the fisherman who's been going out to fish for 40 years and says, right, stop the boat here, we're going to fish. And it's great. And you've got the guy who's totally scientific and goes out and says, right, we're going to fish here. And it's the guy who's been doing it for 40 years that sort of finds the fish. And I guess it's that tacit knowledge, that experience that just can help nudge and bring a conversation, a set of decisions into quite a productive end.
Without breaking any confidences, can you give me an example that brings that to life?
I chaired a Remco at a particular company. We had a cultural challenge. We had owners from one part of the world and the chief exec was from another part of the world. And the board had many interests in many different companies. And their knowledge and understanding of this particular sector was scant. And you had a chief exec who had been a lifer in this industry and understood it in black and white. And he wanted to take it in one direction, and the ownership wanted to take it in another direction. And what I actually sort of agreed with them was actually, let's actually formulate a sort of a board that can actually bring some experience in, that actually can take us to a better outcome. And actually, they were agreeable to that. So they'll actually, we're trying to do something here, which is culturally, we just don't really understand. And actually having a group of 3 or 4 non-execs come back to us with a sensible set of recommendations on an independent basis is actually very helpful. And actually that made the chief exec sort of feel more confident in his position, and that organisation has gone from strength to strength. But from a governance perspective, it actually helped the owners as well drive something to a sensible result.
Interesting. Time has flown. It's time to go on to our lightning round, if you're ready, where I say a short statement and ask you for a quick response.
Let's have a go.
First up, boardroom behaviour that irritates you most.
Limited experience of the organisation.
Best book every board member should read and why.
Book I read years ago called Memos from the Chairman by a guy called Alan Greenberg, who was the founder of Bear Stearns. And he just reminds you not to believe in the smell of your own perfume. It's really good.
Love it. I've not read that one. I will add that to the list. Your favourite quote and why?
If I had more time, I would have written a shorter letter, which I think was written by Mark Twain. And I think we still, in organisations, just use too many words where fewer would suffice.
Love it. Your most significant professional insight?
Don't do people's jobs for them.
Brilliant. The worst professional advice you have ever received?
It was one of my first bosses who said, you only get to enjoy 20% of your job, which I'm going to do something else.
Fantastic. And last but not least, if there are 3 things that listeners should take away from this podcast, if they take away nothing else, what are they?
Communicate. Be clear about the purpose of your organisation, what you're up to, what you're doing, and just go get the best talent you possibly can, wherever it lies.
Brilliant. Daniel, thank you so much for taking the time. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you and so many fascinating insights on the topic of engaging talent.
Thank you.
And thanks to all of you listening. We've been blown away by the incredible feedback about how this podcast has been helping you get board roles and become better board members. This podcast is for you, so if you'd like to suggest guests, topics, difficult challenges, or you'd like to share stories about how the podcast has impacted you, or have suggestions on how we can improve, please email podcast@nurole.com. That's podcast@nurole.com, and let me know. I'd love to hear from you. Otherwise, thanks again for listening, and look forward to having you back here for the next discussion.